3 years ago, my partner and I purchased our initial home. It was a modest dwelling, and our neighbors were wonderful. Life was incredibly pleasant. So much so that 18 months later, when those neighbors decided to sell their house, which was larger and featured more amenities like a driveway, a garage, and a bathtub, we eagerly seized the opportunity. We bought their residence and listed our old one, right next door, for sale. After reviewing several compelling letters from prospective buyers, we selected a Polish couple. They conversed with us exclusively in English, unlike our own Dutch. Yet, everything appeared normal. They inquired about some household tips, and we exchanged pleasant, low-key small talk. In hindsight, however, that was merely the prelude to disaster. Even before the major incidents, things felt peculiar. We began experiencing strange disturbances at the most unusual hours. Sometimes at midnight, we'd suddenly hear heavy thudding or incredibly loud music blaring through the shared walls. It wasn't constant, but it was frequent enough to make us feel uneasy, as if we didn't truly comprehend who resided just a few feet away. The first warning sign emerged when the neighbor returned home with significant damage to both sides of his car. It appeared as though he had scraped against a guardrail at high speed on both sides. When we asked what had occurred, he offered a clumsy excuse: a concrete pole on one side and a trailer making an overly wide turn on the other. We chose to believe him, despite the mathematics not quite adding up. One evening, around 6 p.m., the neighbor contacted us in a complete panic. He claimed that individuals were outside his house, repositioning security cameras. He pleaded with us to investigate and contact the police. We looked, and indeed, 2 men were in the process of breaking in. We immediately called law enforcement. It took the officers 20 minutes to arrive, by which time the burglars had already fled. The neighbor's wife then sped into the street, parked her car, and frantically rushed inside to her beloved small French bulldog and the police, who were already present. As I was curiously walking my dog, I observed the husband parking his car 3 streets away and walking to the scene as if attempting to conceal the vehicle from the police. However, that thought didn't register with me at the time. Later, upon reviewing the doorbell footage, we saw the burglars standing there before the break-in, calmly discussing in Polish which house to target. Nothing was stolen. No one was apprehended. I informed the police that it felt like a setup, but I never received a follow-up. A week later, I was at a housewarming party when my partner sent me a text message. The music next door is insanely loud again. A few minutes later, he called me, his tone shifting to pure terror. The neighbor's car had just careened through our front garden and crashed into the neighbor's own front door. 2 men were frantically loading the car with high-end electronics like flat-screen TVs, professional speakers, and other expensive equipment. They looked like the same individuals from the previous week. This time, the police responded much faster, arriving in precisely 7 minutes. The officers intercepted the men while they were still loading the vehicle. When asked for identification, the men claimed they had none. Then things became surreal. The man behind the wheel looked the officer directly in the eye and asserted he was my neighbor, using my neighbor's actual name. But there was a crucial detail. In the 9 months they had lived next to us, my neighbor had never uttered a single word of Dutch. This man, however, spoke fluent Dutch with a pronounced Polish accent. Realizing their deception was exposed, the men slammed the car into gear, and a violent pursuit ensued through our quiet streets until the police managed to corner and arrest them. But my partner could still hear movement inside our neighbor's house. The police re-entered and dragged out a 3rd suspect. As we were inside our own home with an officer reporting the damage to our property, the doorbell rang. We turned around, and there he was, the actual neighbor. He was unrecognizable. His face was a swollen, bloody mess. One eye was swollen shut, his mouth was torn, and his arm hung at a useless angle, covered in what appeared to be defensive stab wounds. He looked feral, aggressive, and utterly broken. The police officer attempted to intervene, but the neighbor adamantly refused to file a report or cooperate. Since the victim would not speak, the officer had no choice but to send him back to his house. Later that night, the neighbor rang our bell again. He was trembling. He confessed to having cheated on his wife and claimed she had sent people to take him out. He begged to sleep at our house. Terrified and wanting no part of this underworld drama, we refused. My partner offered to drive him to the hospital instead. We dropped him off at 10:30 p.m., informing him we were staying elsewhere for the night because we no longer felt safe, but we didn't stay elsewhere. We returned home, locked every door, and tried to regulate our breathing. At approximately 1 a.m., our dog began growling, a specific low growl he only uses when someone is at the door. We checked the doorbell camera, and there he was. The neighbor was back from the hospital, standing on our porch, ringing the doorbell multiple times. We sat in the dark, silently watching the screen. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a car turned onto the street. The neighbor panicked. He scrambled off the porch and concealed himself behind our cars in the driveway, crouching in the shadows. Witnessing this bloodied, broken man lurking in the dark behind our own vehicles was one of the most unsettling sights I have ever encountered. The car stopped and a woman exited. It was his wife. She walked toward her front door, paused, and glanced toward our driveway. She saw him. We held our breath, anticipating a confrontation or worse. She walked toward him, and as she stepped into the pale yellow glow of the street lamp, she began to wail, a haunting, guttural cry. He remained silent, and she continued asking questions, her sobbing growing louder and louder, echoing through the empty street. Eventually, they both got into the car and drove away. We did not see them for 3 days. We didn't even know where their dog was. The wife eventually returned alone. She found the dog inside and told us she doesn't think she'll ever see her husband again. Whatever the true story is, drugs, debt, or a marriage turned lethal, I've realized one thing. I don't think I want to know. This all began back in 2017 when I relocated to a new house in the suburbs of Montreal, Canada, with my parents and younger sister. Before delving into the intriguing part of the story, I need to clarify a few details about my room and its position within the house for everything to make sense from my perspective. The house we moved into is a split-level home, meaning it features staggered floor levels connected by short flights of stairs. My room was neither on the main floor nor in the basement. It resided precisely between the two, at ground level. One wall shared space with the garage, and the opposite side boasted a large window that overlooked the backyard. At the time, that window had plastic vertical blinds with several missing panels. Consequently, even when fully closed, I could still see outside through the gaps. On the garage side of my room was my closet, which had large sliding mirrored doors. This implied that when I was in bed, regardless of which way I faced, I could always see my window reflected back at me. I started noticing things about a year after we moved in, when I was 15. I recall watching YouTube videos on my tablet late at night as I struggled with insomnia. One night, I heard something outside my window. I had left it open because it was intensely hot, and we hadn't yet invested in an AC unit, so I relied on any breeze I could get. After hearing what sounded like footsteps or shuffling, I quickly paused my video and put the tablet down. The noise ceased concurrently with the video, leading me to believe it had simply been part of what I was watching, or perhaps my imagination. I resumed the video and heard it again. I looked to my left toward the window, but saw nothing. So, I eventually drifted off to sleep. For a few nights, nothing occurred. But then one night, a couple of nights later, during my usual late-night YouTube and show-watching routine, I heard the shuffling again. I paused what I was watching and listened, this time for a longer duration than before. I swear I could hear breathing now too. I glanced at my window, but again, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and turned to face my closet instead. As I picked my tablet back up to resume the video, I saw something move at my window through one of the gaps in the blinds, reflected in the mirror. A shiver ran down my spine. I immediately got up and went to wake my parents, deciding it was better to be safe than sorry. I told them what I had seen and heard, and even though my dad clearly doubted me, he went outside to check the backyard. A few minutes later, he returned, stating he had checked every corner and didn't see anything. He told me that if someone had been there, he would have heard them enter through the squeaky gate, or he at least would have heard them leave. He also checked the Ring camera, which showed no one walking around the house toward the backyard. I suggested that the person could have jumped the fence into the neighbor's yard, but he quickly dismissed that, saying we lived in a safe neighborhood and that I should stop watching scary movies. Unfortunately, I believed him and went back to bed. Every couple of weeks or months thereafter, I'd hear things again. Each time, I convinced myself it was all in my head and tried to focus on my videos or fall asleep. When winter arrived and everything was covered in snow, it stopped, and I eventually forgot about it. But the following year, it resumed. It didn't happen frequently, once or twice a month at most, and always past 11 p.m. I tried not to pay attention to it, even when the noises sounded like clear footsteps or deep breathing. I attributed everything to watching an excessive number of scary movies and videos, even when I deliberately avoided looking out the window, convinced it was merely my imagination. A part of me dreaded confirming my suspicions. One evening, overriding my better judgment, I glanced not directly at the window. That was too frightening, but at the mirror instead. This time, I'm certain I saw a human silhouette. I dashed upstairs, and once again, after a thorough check of the backyard, my dad reiterated the same assurance he had given me the year prior, and just as before, I believed him. This pattern persisted. I started retiring to bed earlier, listening to videos louder or with headphones, and entirely steering clear of my mirror, or, worse, directly staring at my window. The occurrences consistently ceased with the colder weather and resumed each mid-spring. One blustery night in early December 2021, I was engrossed in a stream with my boyfriend on Discord when, around 11:30 p.m., I decided to get a glass of water. On my way, I noticed my parents in the living room, which surprised me, as they rarely stayed up so late, much less outside their bedroom. Their expressions were tense and worried. I inquired if everything was all right, but they dismissively assured me it was nothing. I presumed I had interrupted a private conversation and headed back toward my room. As I turned toward the stairs, flashes of red and blue light through the front window caught my attention. A police car was pulling into our driveway. My parents immediately rose, as if expecting this, and hurried me to my room, saying they'd call me if necessary. I craved answers, but understood it wasn't the moment to press. So, I returned to my room, consumed by curiosity. Less than 2 minutes later, I was summoned upstairs again. This time, they didn't keep me in the dark. My dad explained that about 15 to 20 minutes earlier, amidst the windstorm, he had stepped into the backyard to ensure nothing had blown away before bed. While surveying the yard, he noticed the light from my bedroom window illuminating something nearby. As his eyes adjusted, he recognized it was a man standing motionless just outside my window, staring in. My dad yelled at him and advanced, but the man immediately turned and fled, leaping the back fence effortlessly, as if he'd done it innumerable times before, and vanished into the neighboring yards. In that instant, everything I had feared for years transitioned from a possibility into a tangible fact. I hadn't imagined it. Someone genuinely had been there. Terrified, my parents promptly called the police and then went to warn the next-door neighbor. The elderly woman living there didn't open her door. Instead, she shouted at them to leave or she would call the police herself. The police eventually arrived, but since my dad hadn't clearly seen the man, there was little they could do beyond increasing patrols in the area and recommending we install more cameras, which we did. In retrospect, my back neighbor's reaction still strikes me as profoundly suspicious. Why was her initial response to threaten my parents when they had only knocked to warn her? This raises several questions. Was she living with the man my dad saw, or had she seen him too and genuinely believed it was him knocking? Did I know the person who stood outside my window for years? Or was it just some unsettling stranger who noticed a teenage girl's room with poorly covered blinds and took advantage of it? Did he only intend to watch, or was he preparing for something more sinister? Even now, those questions torment me. Knowing that someone was truly there all along makes every sound I dismissed, every breath I thought I imagined, and every silhouette I forced myself not to look at feel infinitely more terrifying. I've since relocated rooms and can no longer view the windows facing our backyard in the same way. Thankfully, mine now faces the street. What frightens me most isn't that it happened. It's how long it persisted undetected and how easily it could have continued. It was a cold winter day in mid-December, and I was 15 years old. Originally, my parents and I lived in an apartment in a suburban area of Alberta. However, we were running out of space, and with my younger sister on the way, we knew we had to move to a larger house. It initially seemed fortuitous for us because a house just a few blocks away was selling for a very low price. Admittedly, it wasn't the most attractive or in the best neighborhood, but it offered room for expansion, and for the price we paid, we could renovate to our heart's content. My dad did undertake some renovations with our remaining funds, primarily in the basement, as it was nearly uninhabitable without repairs. This included cleaning, carpeting, new beams, fixing the bathroom, and applying fresh wallpaper featuring a cool pattern. I got to choose myself. For the first couple of months, living there was great, and I truly enjoyed the new house until the first unsettling incident occurred. It was my father's birthday, and to celebrate, we had all gone out to a restaurant in the evening. Everything went smoothly until we returned home to find our front door wide open. My mom was utterly shaken, and we pleaded with my dad to drive us away from the house while she called the police. My dad retrieved a large, heavy wrench from his toolbox in the truck and entered the house to search for an intruder. My mom and I called the police anyway, and we sat there for 5 excruciatingly long minutes before they arrived. They searched the house and found my dad, who then came out and informed us that nothing had been stolen and no one was inside. However, some of our belongings were displaced or knocked over, specifically the books on my bookshelf. The police eventually concluded their search and relayed the same information. We were still somewhat paranoid, but finally we re-entered our home. From that day forward, I would frequently hear strange noises emanating from the walls, and sometimes from beneath our basement. It's worth noting that my room was in the basement, but I always dismissed the sounds as mere pipes. After all, it was an older house. That was until one night something inexplicable happened. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was playing with my Nintendo DS under the covers with the volume off, so my parents wouldn't know I was still awake. That's when I heard it, clear laughter coming from the wall beside my bed. My heart froze, and my eyes likely widened to the size of saucers. I didn't know what to do. Ignore it? Call my parents? Investigate? I decided to wait a while to see if it happened again, but after about 30 minutes of lying still as a stone, I concluded it must have been my sleep-deprived imagination, and finally drifted off to sleep. I woke up the next morning in my bed as usual. Nothing had changed. Despite that laugh still vivid in my mind, I tried to dismiss it. I would continue to hear the same peculiar noises intermittently for the next couple of weeks, but by then, it felt normal to me. Now this is when the next event occurred. By this time, My sister had already been born, and since the basement was spacious enough, and my mom trusted me to keep her safe at night, she shared the room with me. This doesn't mean my mom didn't use baby monitors. She did. She kept the parent units in the living room and the other in the kitchen. One night, my parents had gone out for a late-night dinner, leaving me to look after the house until they returned. I was in the living room watching a movie when I got up to grab a snack from the kitchen. That's when I noticed odd noises coming from the baby monitor, and my heart sank. I knew no one else was home, but those were footsteps, loud, heavy footsteps. Suddenly, my fear materialized when my sister started crying, and I heard a faint shh sound from the speaker, followed by a crash. I instantly did the first thing that came to mind, which, now thinking clearly in retrospect, could have gotten us both killed. I ran as quickly as I could up to my parents' room and grabbed my father's rifle. However, I didn't have the key to unlock the trigger lock or any ammunition. I figured I would pretend it was loaded and try to conceal the lock with my hand. If attacked, I would use the buttstock to defend myself. All I could think of was getting my sister to safety. When I reached the basement door, I opened it quietly and walked down the steps, turning to face my sister's crib. No one was there, but she was still crying, and the baby monitor was on the ground, sideways. I mustered all the courage I could and yelled, "I'm armed! Come out before I find you!" Still nothing. I grabbed my sister and ran upstairs. I closed the basement door and wedged a chair under the handle to keep it locked while I called my parents. They called the police and got home as fast as they could. The police arrived at my house before my parents did, so they made me sit in the back of the cop car with my baby sister, while one of the officers went inside to investigate. When my parents arrived, I recounted everything that had happened. They were confused but deeply concerned. They knew I wasn't the type of child who would lie about something like this. The police officer came out and gave us an all clear, stating no one was in the house. Just as they finished speaking with us and were about to leave, my dad anxiously asked them if they had checked behind the bookshelf. In my room, there was a bookshelf embedded into the wall, so I was very confused when my dad asked to look behind it. The police officer was confused too, and asked my father to come inside with him and point out what he meant. To our astonishment, upon reaching the basement, we discovered my bookshelf nudged ajar, akin to an open door. The basement window, which provided access to the backyard, was fully open, with my desk chair positioned beneath it. Tucked behind the bookshelf was a small room, housing some of our house's pipes, which snaked along certain walls. On the floor lay various food wrappers, one of our missing cups, a bottle of lotion, a switchblade, and a partially eaten, yet still somewhat fresh apple. Someone had been residing in our home without our knowledge all this time. According to the police, it was highly probable that the perpetrator escaped through the open